Welcome, bienvenue, excellencies, distinguished guests. We're delighted to have each and every one of you with us here today on this cold Ottawa morning. You're the courageous ones. Yes, it is a pleasure to welcome you here as we have the privilege to hear about the Canadian political landscape, to learn more about the Liberal leadership contest, as well as what might trigger our election. Obviously, in times like these that are kind of perplexing, worrisome, globally, certainly nationally here in Canada, we are all looking for assurance and hope. And so we trust that you'll gain insights today on some of the realities, but as well that you will also sense the peace of our Creator, the one who said, "Be still and know that I am God." And so today we offer this event because, in fact, for the last 9 years, we've offered something similar in regard to leadership races for different parties at the request of some of your colleagues, other diplomats who said, we want to understand more of what's going on. So that's why we offer what we do. And I am Darlene McLean, Executive Director of the Christian Embassy. And I and my colleagues and some wonderful volunteers are really delighted to be able to offer this to you today. So to give you a quick sense of who we are, we, along with about 12 other Christian embassies with whom we're networked, we seek to provide opportunities to connect diplomatic, political, and business leaders together, and to give you that opportunity to get to know each other and to build trusted relationships. So we trust that this is part of that even today. And then we do all kinds of different events. We offer English as a second language. Obviously, we're meeting one-on-one. We do business tours, other things too. So we hope to see you in future at other ones as they are of interest to you. Ultimately, we want to inspire you. And that is not we ourselves, but ultimately with the person and the values of Jesus. And so without any further ado, I will introduce our moderator, Mr. Harold Albrecht, who is moderator because he has served as Member of Parliament for almost 14 years. Prior to that, he was a dentist. Anyway, he continues to be passionate about politics, even though he's not involved. So he will be leading the way and introducing our other two speakers. So please welcome with me Harold, who also happens to be my husband.
That's the real reason I'm here. Thank you, Darlene. I want to welcome all of you ambassadors and diplomats from many countries of the world today to hear this presentation by some very knowledgeable people. I am here as a former MP, but believe me, I have a lot to learn. So I'm looking forward to learning along with you today. Our panelists today, first of all, Lucas Malinowski, who's beside me. He's the public affairs professional currently serving as the Director of Federal Affairs at the Global Automakers of Canada. He has served in premiers, cabinet ministers' offices, and a wide variety of public affairs and communication clients, including the Government of Ontario from 2014 to 2018. So welcome, Lucas. Good to have you with us. And joining us online is Michael Donison, a lecturer in the Department of Economics, Philosophy, and Political Science at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, in Kelowna, British Columbia. He's teaching an introductory course on Canadian politics. He has been a political consultant and analyst for more than 20 federal and provincial elections and has served in a number of political roles in Ottawa. So we're going to look to Lucas first for his presentation on the leadership race for the Liberal Party of Canada 2025. So welcome, Lucas. Proceed with your presentation. Welcome to here.
Thank you, Harold, and thanks to Darlene and Christian Embassy for having me with you today, and Cardis for hosting us in their lovely space. A quick point of clarification. Harold mentioned I work for the Global Automakers of Canada right now, so I'm not appearing in any professional capacity or representing that organization. But Darlene reached out and asked to provide a bit of a presentation on the Liberal leadership race, which I'm sure everyone's very curious about, and you've been hearing lots of things in the media about. I have some experience in the Liberal Party of Canada, working on a number of leadership races and general campaigns, but I am not working on any campaigns in this leadership, so I'm not speaking for any of the campaigns there either, just providing my comments as private interested citizen. 2025 Liberal Party of Canada leadership race. First, I want to start with providing some key considerations and context that are really important to keep in mind when you're looking at how the party is choosing its new leader. First of all, this is the first leadership for the Liberal Party of Canada since 2013, which is when Justin Trudeau was chosen as the party leader. The party hasn't gone through this exercise in a very long time. In the last 12 years, the party really has become the party of the Prime Minister, which is not unusual. Typically in Canada, when you have a party in power for a long time, a lot of the infrastructure and knowledge gets centered around government, and the party apparatus itself atrophies a little bit. So you don't have the talent, you're not focused on maintaining the party itself and preparing yourself for when inevitably you're not in government. So the party's dealing with some of those challenges now, shaking off the rust and wrapping its head around how to run a leadership race in really unprecedented and uncertain times. So the reason we have this race is because the party found itself at historic low levels of support, following nearly a decade of government, and specifically the Prime Minister being largely unpopular in the population. So the party members and government MPs had been calling on the Prime Minister to consider stepping aside and creating an opportunity for someone new to lead the party into the next election sooner rather than later. Like all prime ministers, he felt he was still the best person to lead the party into the next general election. And you don't get to be in that position in politics without being convinced you're the best person for the job. So not unusual, but all that came to a head, as I'm sure you know, when his finance minister and deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, abruptly resigned on the day she was to deliver the fall economic statement. And that really set the wheels in motion, where the prime minister recognized that he just didn't have the support of the party anymore and would be having to spend the next year or so fighting internal battles rather than being prepared for the next general election. So he did announce that he would be stepping aside once the party chose a new leader in March. And that new leader of the party will also automatically become the Prime Minister of Canada. In Canada, we don't directly elect prime ministers. We elect local members of parliament who then form a governing party, control of the House. So the Liberal Party still commands control of the House, even though it's not sitting, but whoever becomes leader of the party will automatically become the Prime Minister. And then, of course, the biggest question over everything, as the members of the leader of the Liberal Party are considering who to choose for the next leader, is going to be who will be potentially best positioned to deal with a Trump presidency, which we've already seen will create a lot of uncertainty and potential challenges for the government of Canada. So that's a bit of the context of what the party's dealing with. And now let's chat about some key timelines. So back in January, we had the deadline for people to put themselves forward as an official candidate to be leader of the party, as well as the deadline for people to become members of the party and be able to vote in the leadership. There were some candidates who declared themselves and were either not approved or subsequently stepped back and decided they didn't want to continue with their candidacy. And we may see more of that. So I'll speak about the candidates shortly, but right now there are 5 approved candidates for the leadership. By February 7th, they will have to give another non-refundable $125,000 payment to the party. That's money that can't come out of their own pocket. They have to fundraise that money. So if any of the candidates find that they can't get enough money to make that payment, we may see some more drop off. And then if they survive the February 7th deadline, there's another one 10 days later of another $125,000 payment. So the reason the party sets up these payment structures is really to keep serious candidates in the race and make sure you can fundraise, you can organize, and you don't have 20 people on a debate stage, some of whom are really just in the race to raise their own political profile. We're going to have the results of who the new leader is on March 9th. And on March 24th, Parliament is scheduled to return from its current prorogation. I have a couple question marks beside the March 24th date, and I think Mike, our next speaker, will chat about that a little bit. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So the membership of the party, as it currently stands, before the race started, there were 80,000 registered Liberals. There are now 400,000 registered Liberals. So quite a significant number of people who signed up to be able to vote in the race. That number will probably change because the party is going to have to go through everyone who registered and make sure that they are really legitimate people. The way the system currently is, you just had to sign up, provide an email and address and your full name. Unlike other parties, there's no fee to become a member of the party. In the past, the Liberal Party, you would have to put $5, $10 in. You don't have to do that anymore. So I think there will be a lot of those memberships which are not legitimate, and the party's going to bring that number down. But those are the people who can vote in choosing who the next leader is. They have to be at least 14 years of age, support the purposes of the party, and there's some other requirements there. So that's who gets to vote. Now, how a winner is chosen by the party, and this is the system. There are 343 ridings in Canada. Each riding gets 100 points in the leadership race. So there is a total of 34,300 points to be won. And in order to win, whoever gets to 17,151 points is the next leader of the party. So a few things to keep in mind here. The 100 points per riding is really important because you have some ridings where the Liberals have MPs, they have a strong base, so you might have 1,000, 2,000 members. So if you win all those 2,000 votes in a particular riding in Toronto, it's worth just as much as winning the 15 votes that might be in a small rural riding in Saskatchewan. So a lot of organizers are going to be looking at those areas of the country where there actually aren't a lot of Liberal members, because a vote there is worth a lot more than a vote in downtown Toronto. It's a preferential ranked ballot. So every ballot you get to choose in numbered 1 to 5 who your preferred candidates are. And in the first round, the points are counted up. So let's say in one riding, each candidate got 20% of the votes. They would each get 20% of the points for that riding. All those points are counted up. If no one exceeds the 17,151 in the first round of counting ballots, whoever got the least points drops off. And then the party recounts all the second choices for that candidate and distributes those points accordingly until someone passes the 50% threshold. So who are the candidates? I'm sure you all know Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He's currently the prohibitive favorite and front runner. All the polling has him at about 40% ahead of anyone else. And the second really serious candidate is Chrystia Freeland, who I mentioned was the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister and triggered essentially the leadership race. So this is an interesting dynamic between these two. And actually, Mark Carney is the godfather of one of Chrystia Freeland's children. So these two know each other quite well. The Liberal Party's been trying to get Mark Carney to run for office in some capacity, join the government for quite some time. And he's finally decided to step in and throw his hat in the ring. Ms. Freeland, although she got a lot of support and thanks from Liberal MPs for having the courage to step up to the Prime Minister, is actually not finding a lot of support in caucus. Most of the endorsements are going to Carney. And I'll mention this later, but Liberals have a history of having someone come in from outside the party who has ties to the party but has not necessarily been an MP for a really long time, has had some success and profile outside of politics, and bring them in as a savior for the party. It's worked out well in some cases, not so well in others. And I'd say this is the secondary tier of candidates. Karina Gold, who is a minister and an MP for Burlington, is really putting herself forward as the voice of the youth of the party and really trying to rebuild the party as an apparatus itself and focus on the party rather than necessarily going up against Donald Trump or what a government would look like. Frank Baylis, former MP from Quebec, definitely a long shot candidate, successful businessman in medical devices. And Ruby Dhalla, a former MP who's a bit of a wild card in this race. She lost her seat in 2011, hasn't really been around federal politics since then, but has inserted herself as a bit of a disruptor and has actually been quite critical of the current Prime Minister and the party as it's been for the last 15 years. She'll be an interesting one because really the race is all about how well can you organize. It's not who has the best policy, it's how many memberships can you sign up and how many of those could you get to vote for you. And she came out of the gate rather suddenly and was able to organize the signatures and the money to be in the race. So she may be an interesting one to watch. And finally, what are Liberals really looking for when they're choosing a new leader? It's three things: electability, electability. The history of the party is choosing who they think has the best chance of either getting them into government or keeping them into government. It's not who has the strongest policy vision. Some people really do care about that. But as an organization, the Liberal Party always looks at who has the best chance of winning the next general election, and that's the person who should be the leader of the party.
Thanks very much, Lucas. I'm going to ask Mike now to start on his presentation of the general election, how they're called and what triggers them.
Thank you to the Christian Embassy for asking me to do this. I think it's the 5th or 6th time I've made a presentation. I'm sad I can't be with you in person, but glad to be connected by Zoom. The question I'm going to cover, and a related question, is the question was, how does an election come about? In other words, in our Canadian political system, how is a general election triggered? And in order that to happen, there are two key political actors. I think some of you will be aware of this: the Prime Minister and the Governor General. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. They are the only two key actors. The rules that govern this are a little bit by law, but mostly governed under our British constitutional system by what are called constitutional conventions. These are simply binding political rules of political conduct, but they're not as a matter of law. They're not legally required. So an election can be triggered. There are about 4 or 5 different situations, and I'll go through them very quickly, where an election being triggered. The most uncommon one is there is a provision in the Constitution Act 1867 that no House of Commons or Legislative Assembly, Provincial Legislative Assembly, can have a term of longer than 5 years. So there could be a situation where the 5 years are up, in which case the Prime Minister would have to get involved in giving advice. That's almost never happened. I think it might have happened once in Canadian political history in 1896, but I'm not sure. That's very rare. The other instance, much more common, is, of course, we now have a provision in our Canada Elections Act, it's not in the Constitution, that normally we have a life of Parliament is only supposed to be for 4 years. It's called the fixed term election date. And it basically says that if a Parliament has been elected, there should be a new election by law within 4 years of the election of the current Parliament. That would be another situation where a Prime Minister would have to get involved in advising a dissolution. There's some argument about whether he's constitutionally obliged, and I would submit that if a Prime Minister chose to go beyond the 4 years, the Governor General would accede to that, and it could go a maximum of 5. That's never been tested. Much more common is a situation where the life of Parliament isn't coming to an end, the fixed date election date hasn't arrived yet, but the current government is defeated on the floor of the House of Commons on a recorded vote that is regarded as a matter of confidence. Now, there's a little bit of a confusing area. Generally, confidence for sure would consist, for instance, if there's an opposition motion expressing non-confidence in the government, the technical phraseology, at least in the United Kingdom, is, be it resolved that this House no longer has confidence in His Majesty's advisors or ministers. I think now they just use the word government. Anyway, if such a measure passed by a majority vote, then constitutionally the Prime Minister would be obliged to do one of two things. He or she could attend on the Governor General and advise a dissolution. We'll talk about that. Or he or she could resign. That's very rare and has only happened 2 times since Confederation. So normally the conventions of the Constitution dictate the Prime Minister seeking a dissolution. There's some issue about what constitutes confidence. Other than express motion or a matter which the government in advance has indicated it considers a matter of confidence, all others are what are called implied. So in other words, there are situations where there may not be a dissolution. But normally speaking, if the government is defeated on the throne speech, the recommendation to adopt the throne speech, or in major budgetary matters, that's generally regarded as confidence. But again, that's up to the Prime Minister to decide. The other example is simply where 5 years haven't run up, election date hasn't arrived, and the government hasn't been defeated, but the Prime Minister decides that he wants a general election. And generally speaking, there's some argument about that, but certainly a majority Prime Minister has a dissolution in his pocket whenever he or she wants. In other words, if the Prime Minister attends on the Governor General, certainly if it is a majority situation, or even a minority situation and wants a dissolution, he's going to get it. And that's quite common as well. So those are the circumstances where a dissolution can occur. And a dissolution has to occur first before there could be a general election. There's a little bit of confusion too over the conventions. Traditionally in the English practice, it was a recommendation of the full cabinet. But in Canada, certainly since 1935, and maybe sooner, this is solely the discretion of the Prime Minister alone. Now, that doesn't mean a Prime Minister doesn't consult with his colleagues or his ministers in advance to get their consent, but there's no constitutional requirement for him or her to do so. So those are the situations where a dissolution can occur. Quickly, the process, and this is partly by convention and partly by law. A decision is made by the Prime Minister to attend on the Governor General to advise her to dissolve Parliament. There's a series of documents that need to be prepared. Now, quite frankly, these will have already been prepared in advance, drafted by the PMO, PCO, and in cooperation with the Governor General's Secretary. But basically what happens, this is the format. The Prime Minister personally attends. This usually cannot be done by phone. The Prime Minister has to personally attend on the Governor General, hand to her a document called an instrument of advice. Nothing fancy about that. It's simply a letter addressed to the Governor General, signed by the Prime Minister on the letterhead of the Prime Minister, in which he simply requests and advises her to dissolve the Parliament of Canada. Normally speaking, the Governor General will accept that advice. That's usually just done verbally. She'll just say, I accept that advice. As soon as she's done that, the next step is another document that will have been pre-prepared for her called the Proclamation of Dissolution. And the reason it's called a proclamation is because a lot of people don't understand this. The legal power to dissolve is not a statutory power. It resides in the Governor General by what's called the royal prerogative. So it's simply called a proclamation under the royal prerogative power, and it's simply an order in which she instructs the House of Commons members, they've all been dismissed and no longer are MPs, and the Senate is sent away, and Parliament is dissolved. Interestingly, although all members of the House of Commons are no longer members, they continue to have their full pay and benefits until election day. And the senators keep collecting their salary, but they're in suspense. So at that point, Parliament has now been dissolved. The next step, though, which would have been prepared, in order to actually get the election going, it's now a legal requirement. The Canada Elections Act requires that there actually be an order in council. And an order in council is the governor acting on the advice of the cabinet. So there would have had to at least been some cabinet deliberation for this. And it's simply an order. It's signed by 4 ministers of the Crown, could be including the Prime Minister. It's presented to the Governor General, and it's simply an order signed by the Governor General directing the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada, a very important official, to issue writs, that is the orders for the election for the 343 constituencies. Now, all of this would have been prearranged and discussed with the Chief Electoral Officer. He will be well aware of all of this. And usually the order to him is to do 3 things. It gives the election date, and under the Canada Elections Act, the earliest date can be 36 days from the dissolution, but it can be as great as 50. And again, that's the discretion of the Prime Minister. The Governor General will simply sign off on that date. There'll also be a direction as to what is the nomination date. That is, what is the cutoff date for candidates to file their nominations with the returning officer in each of the 340 constituencies. And then it's the election date itself, and perhaps the advance poll dates is included. So that's signed off. That's now the direction, and that can be delivered to the Chief Electoral Officer, and he can commence the election. There is a third step, though, that's required very quickly, is a second instrument of advice has to be given by the Prime Minister to the Governor General, and that's simply asking her to set the date, what's called the summons date. When will the new Parliament be called back into session? That's the discretion of the Prime Minister at the time, and she will sign that as well, and the process is then complete. Parliament has been dissolved. A general election is now triggered under the direction of the Chief Electoral Officer, and there's a preliminary date set when the new Parliament, the new House of Commons, and resuspended Senate reconvene in the new Parliament. That's basically what triggers an election in Canada.
You didn't deal with the issue of prorogation. What exactly is prorogation, And who calls for the prorogation and how does that work?
Okay, that's a very current concern. I think we were going to deal with that to some extent in Q&A. A prorogation is different. A prorogation is where the Governor General prorogues Parliament. It doesn't dissolve Parliament, it simply sends them away. It's a fancy type of adjournment. But what it does is it ends the current session of Parliament, right? It's brought to an end. And again, the rules governing that is solely the conventional power of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister would go through the same process of an instrument of advice and so on, but that's to prorogue. Parliament hasn't been dissolved, but it goes away. And we're currently in the situation where on January the 6th, Prime Minister Trudeau gave that advice to the Governor General, which he accepted, and Parliament's prorogued until March 24th. And the effect of that is, and we can talk about the government maybe in the Q&A, what does that do in government? But the bottom line is the House of Commons ceased to exist for the time being, but is reconvened on the new date.
So what effect does it have on the proceedings and measures in Parliament and the ongoing governance of and the executive authority of the government?
Yeah, very quickly, in terms of legislation, what it means is any matters that were on the order paper in the House of Commons, bills, resolutions, if they've not received royal assent, in other words, the legislative process is completed before the Governor General issues the proclamation, then all those measures die. They simply, they no longer exist, and they would have to be reintroduced, in the new session. There's an exception for private members' bills; they continue, but all government proposed legislation dies on the order paper, and it would require the reconvened second session to bring those measures back.
Thanks, Mike. Just a quick question back to Lucas for a minute. You mentioned during your presentation that whoever is chosen as the leader of the Liberal Party will automatically become Prime Minister. How can that happen if he or she is not a member of Parliament? And what are the rules and conventions around this situation?
Yeah, Mike, you'll probably want to add some color to this as well. But as I mentioned, in Canada, we don't directly elect the Prime Minister. You vote for your local member of Parliament, and then at the end of the election, whichever party has the most elected members of Parliament typically is given the first chance to form government. In the case of a minority or in the case of a majority, they're automatically form the government. So the Liberal Party still holds the House of Commons. And there's a separation between the Prime Minister's or executive role, which is the leader of the party which has the most seats in the House or holds the confidence of the House, versus Parliament itself. Now, typically, the Prime Minister is a member of Parliament, but they don't necessarily have to be. And there's some precedent for this, right, Mike?
Yes, there is. The basic constitutional rule is a Prime Minister doesn't have to be a member of Parliament, but they must, in a reasonable period of time, get themselves elected as an MP or get themselves appointed to the Senate.
They would not be sitting in their seat as a member of the House of Commons in the parliamentary discussions.
That's correct. Let's take the current scenario and just say the new Liberal leader becomes Prime Minister shortly after March 9th. There isn't time for a by-election, so whoever that person is, they will be watching the proceedings from the gallery of the House of Commons. They will not have a seat on the floor.
One further question to Lucas. What is the Caretaker Convention, and how would the government operate during an election?
Yeah, and Mike, you probably can add more color from, the statutory and letter of the law perspective. But practically speaking, there's what we refer to as the Caretaker Convention in Canada, which is if you are in a general election, the public service, which is a permanent public service, the bureaucrats, they're not politically appointed, they carry on the work of government, but they don't make significant different policy changes or decisions. So, paychecks still go out. The border patrol still patrol the border while you're in the middle of a general election. But ministers typically can't go to bureaucrats and say, I want to start up a new program. They're still ministers during the election, but you can't essentially create new government spending, new government policy decisions and directions, because under the Caretaker Convention, the idea is you just keep the shop running. We're not creating anything new. We don't know if you're going to be the government on the other side of the election, so we can't permit you to create new permanent programs or policy decisions that the incoming government may not agree with and potentially tie their hands. There's some question right now of whether the government's under the Caretaker Convention as we speak, given that the House is prorogued. All the opposition parties have said that as soon as they have an opportunity to vote against the confidence of the government, they will do so. So ostensibly, as soon as Parliament comes back, the government will fall and will go into a general election. So there's question of whether or not the government as it currently stands is in the Caretaker Convention. And I've heard that there are some officials who are less inclined to take on new projects, new policy directions, and see themselves as already being in that Caretaker Convention. But we still see other significant measures from the government, for example, the action on the border in response to President Trump's concerns. That would be, new policy and potentially new spending. Mike, do you want to add anything to that on the Caretaker Convention?
I think you covered it very well, Lucas. The only point I would make is the Caretaker Convention is not governed by law, it's by practice, and it's developed over the years. The Privy Council Office has issued recent guidelines on that. The Caretaker Convention politically binds the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and also puts stipulations on the public service. Your description was excellent. Basically, there are 5 categories. If it's routine government business, ministers can be involved in routine. Or if it's non-controversial, would be a linkage. If there's an urgency, although there may need to be consultation with the opposition, urgent measures can sometimes be taken as well, which you were referring to. Or if it's a kind of thing that is a minor matter and it's easily reversible, right? In other words, it's a decision that's not that important and it wouldn't be that expensive for the new government, if it's a new political party government, to reverse it. And if it's not in one of those categories, then the convention dictates the Prime Minister has to speak to the opposition leaders and get their consent to those measures. So basically, it just means the government's kind of in a holding pattern. And the important thing is, if I have time on this public service, what it means is that if the day of the dissolution, a minister has on his or her desk an appointment to sign off on, grants are to be given, non-conventional regular contracts, he or she's not supposed to sign them. They just stay on his desk. And for the public service through the clerk is a direction that none of them send up any recommendations to the minister for appointments or major decisions. In other words, public service simply holds off on sending those up to the minister, and the minister in turn doesn't sign any of those kind of documents, but simply waits for the outcome of the election before doing so.
Okay, thanks. Just one last question from me, and then we're going to go back to questions from the audience. We're expecting, many of us are expecting an election in 2025. What will the ballot question be in this upcoming election?
Yes. Well, the way things look right now, although we're dealing with the temporizing nature of a certain president of the United States, but there is quite a possibility, and I think Lucas will like to hear me say this, given that my background is, of course, as a conservative, is that, let's put it this way, the Liberal Party will do all that it can, rightly so, from its point of view, to change the ballot box question. And the ballot box question is who is most able to deal with Trump, right? And these terrorists from the United States. That could change the electoral quotient. It may not, but it seems to me it could change. I'm not going to predict what it's eventually going to be, but it very much could be the major question in the minds of the voters when they're walking into the ballot to cast their votes.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Lucas, I'm interested in hearing your response to that.
It's an important question, Harold, and I might want to take it a step back, actually, because there's also the ballot question for Liberals in choosing a new leader. And so I think the first question Liberals are going to ask themselves is who has the best chance in a general election against Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives.
Is that referred to as electability?
Yes, that would be the electability. And then who will be best suited to deal with the Trump administration? So that's what Liberals are thinking about in the back of their minds. But it's also, I think, important to remind everyone that we don't necessarily have to have an election this year. Parliament is supposed to come back on March 24th. The new leader of the Liberal Party, once they are chosen on Parliament back on 24th, new leader March 4th. There's 2 scenarios. One scenario is the new leader decides, well, I just want to go to an election right now. I don't want to bring Parliament back and have them have an opportunity to defeat my government and decide what they defeat me on. I'm just going to go to an election right now because I need my own mandate. So we might even have an election before March 24th. The second scenario is that the new leader says, well, I think we can stay in government a little bit longer. I think with Trudeau gone, maybe the NDP will be interested in making a new deal with me as the leader, and maybe we can put some other things in the window. And in that case, Parliament comes back and the government isn't immediately defeated. And, I think to Mike's point, the Liberals will try and do everything they can to hold on to power as long as possible. And that's one avenue they have. They could make a deal with an opposition party and not go into a general election, try and be in government for some time, show some success in negotiating with the Trump administration. And then maybe we have an election in October, or maybe even next year, because as Mike mentioned, we have a fixed election date law, but it's not set in stone, let's just say. There's potential that as long as the government holds the support of the House, they can keep governing. So there's a lot of moving pieces and uncertainty here. But to Mike's point, I think the Liberals will absolutely want the ballot question to be who is best suited to negotiate with the Trump administration.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start on some questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to do my best to try to interpret these in the way I think they were intended. Other countries in similar situation to Canada in terms of elections coming up. And this questioner thinks that Trump's decision to cut off all project donations and financial report for judicial reform and for financing funds for government or local authority or NGOs, part of the situation. So these have serious consequences. Do you believe that the pre-election period for our countries is the most important reason that the U.S. is handling such drastic measures all of a sudden? So is it partly because of the instability of our electoral process and the governance, or is this a potential reason?
I think the uncertain political situation we're in this country, and I will remain nonpartisan as to why I think that who is primarily responsible for that, but that's where we're at. And I think President Trump, given his nature, is taking advantage of that. However, knowing Trump or not knowing him, I think it is quite possible that even without the political uncertainty in Canada, he would be engaging in the same kind of tactics. The more and more I'm reading about this, the more and more I realize that the default option for the United States, if you look at their history with us and with the rest of the world, the default option is protectionism. It always has been for America. Since 1945, we lived in a very unusual period in American history of free trade and open markets. Typically, the United States has been a closed, isolationist country. That's its default option. So Trump might have been doing this anyway, despite our particular local political problems.
Yeah, I think Mike hit the nail on the head there, and I wouldn't want to speculate about the president's motives because I think that's a challenging thing to do on a good day. But the instability in Canada is going to be particularly challenging. I think the president senses that and is looking to take advantage of that. So having clarity on the Canadian side of who really is the government and who has a mandate to represent Canada in negotiations with the U.S. is going to be a critical question.
Follow up to that is sort of connected. In which way do the actions and plans of the current U.S. administration vis-a-vis Canada influence the electability of the candidates to lead the Liberal Party, and also the wider electoral campaign should the elections be called? So what is the impact of the U.S.'s actions on the choices that the Liberal Party members might make because of that?
Huge. Yeah. I think, back to the question about what's the ballot question, for the last year or two, everyone's assumption was that the next election was going to be on affordability and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's stepped away, so he's not on the ballot anymore. All the candidates have already, committed in some form or another to get rid of the carbon tax, the retail carbon tax, which was very unpopular. That completely changes the equation for the general election. As I said, Liberals are all about electability. So they will be looking at who can make the case to Canadians that they can handle Trump most effectively. And that's, the two front runners, that's really their sales pitch, right? Chrystia Freeland is saying, I've negotiated with Trump before in the Canada, US, Mexico agreement. I know how to deal with this man and his administration. And Mark Carney's case is, I have a lot of experience in managing large economies and dealing with world leaders. So I have the experience for that as well. And it's going to be really hard for the other candidates, I think, to break through in the conversation because it's going to be much more difficult for them to make the case that they are well positioned to negotiate with Trump.
Just a comment I want to make on this whole issue, and I'll make myself a little unpopular here. What Mr. Trump is threatening to do is very serious. I don't underestimate it, but I think we need to get a little calmer about this, particularly the Premier of Ontario, if I may say so. We are not in an existential threat here with these tariffs. We're in serious economic problems with it. This has happened before. Canada has lived with this kind of tariff situation vis-a-vis the United States in our history. I just think we need to keep calm about this. I think we've just been panicking a little. We got to be tough. We got to be ready. It is very serious, but it is not ultimately an existential threat to Canada. And the president's comments about Canada being the 51st state, folks, he's just trolling us on that. He's not deadly serious about that at all.
Okay, I think I agree with you on that one, Mike. Question that's a totally different approach right now. Is there any situation in which the prorogation period could be suspended by the Governor General and order the reassumption of Parliament before March 24?
That the Prime Minister can bring the House back sooner than the prorogation date, right, Mike?
Yes. This would be very unusual. The Prime Minister would have to attend on the Governor General and advise her, I'm not sure if this has ever happened, she would revoke the proclamation of prorogation that she granted and issue a new one, giving a new date, or revoke it altogether. And then the Prime Minister would have to speak to the Speaker and just have the old, now this is a good question, could the old session come back? And I don't think there's a clear answer in that. So probably what they'd have to do, yes, I think they could revoke the prorogation order and give a new date if they wanted to come back earlier. But the new leader isn't going to be chosen till the 9th of March, and the current prorogation date is the 24th. So I'd be surprised if that would happen. But I guess it would be politically and legally possible. Yes.
So technically possible, but very unlikely.
I think that's the least likely of all these crazy scenarios.
And just a remark I wanted to make about the options. If Mr. Carney say he's the new Prime Minister, he could choose just to seek a dissolution, immediate election. You're right. If he decides to face the House on the 24th, the problem they have is the government does not have interim supply. So normally when a new session comes back, there's a throne speech as the first order of business. That would have to be waived because an interim supply bill, unless there's unanimous agreement, is going to take at least 3 days to get through the House. And so I think if the new Parliament's called in, I think we can have the speech from the throne, but the first order of business can't be the throne speech. It would have to be the interim supply bill to get them past March 31st. Because at the moment, the government of Canada has no authority to spend any money on or after the morning of April the 1st. That would require Mr. Singh's cooperation. The bottom line is the NDP would have to agree to waive the standing orders, right? And allow the interim supply bill to go through as quickly as possible. Of course, it'd have to go through the Senate too, and make the March 31st deadline.
So how long will it take for the opposition to table a non-confidence motion once Parliament reconvenes? Or would it just be easier to wait for the budget bill, which is expected to be tabled in March, and defeat rather than table a separate motion?
Well, there isn't going to be a budget bill introduced between the 24th of March and the 31st of March because the government doesn't have time. I don't see that happening. But can you just repeat the question?
How long would it take for the opposition to table a non-confidence motion?
Well, they can table it right away, but the question is, this gets very technical, about they need to have a supply day to be able to do that, an opposition day. Now, actually, this is another problem people haven't thought about. Between March 24th and 26th, under the standing orders, the opposition are entitled to 8 supply days. Well, that would take up the first 2 days of the House. So again, you would have to waive the standing orders to delay the ability of the opposition to bring in not to bring in, but to debate and vote on a motion of non-confidence. It gets very technical and very tricky.
So again, almost impossible.
Probably.
A question to Lucas. Ruby Dhalla, as you have said, is a disruptor candidate and might still stand a good chance at the leadership. When Chandra Arya was disqualified, Ms. Dhalla spoke about being the only South Asian candidate in the running. Frankly speaking, is Canada ready for a South Asian Prime Minister? What are her chances in the leadership in terms of percentage? Easy question. Next question.
That's an excellent question, and I appreciate it. So yeah, Dr. Dhalla, as I said, is a disruptor candidate. I think she's a very long shot to actually win the leadership overall, but I think she may perform more strongly than some would expect. You know, Canada's South Asian diaspora has a long history of being very well politically organized. And in leadership races, that really matters because it really comes down to who can sign up the most members and who can get those members to actually vote when they have to vote. And the South Asian community has always been strong in that regard. Political organizers in the South Asian community are very coveted in every leadership race of any party, I would say. And is Canada ready for its first South Asian Prime Minister? I think potentially, if the right candidate comes along. I don't know if Mr. Singh is that person. Yeah, I think if you have the right candidates, you know, a lot can happen.
I don't think there's any question that the fact that she's South Asian, I don't think is relevant.
Okay, I would agree with you. Yeah.
Quite frankly, Canada's ready for a woman. We had a woman prime minister. Great Britain had a South Asian prime minister recently. No, I don't think her problem is that. I think her problem is that Mr. Carney is so far ahead, it's just going to be virtually impossible for anybody, including her, to overcome him. But not because she's South Asian. I don't think that's going to be a factor at all. It shouldn't be a factor, in fact.
And I would agree with you. I think the general mood of Canada is ready for whoever is the best leader, regardless of their background.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If a caretaker government is in place, could they negotiate with the Trump administration on any action to be taken to avoid tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. They're doing it now. You know, the prime minister is negotiating directly with the president. Cabinet ministers are meeting directly with their U.S. counterparts, and no one's really screaming and saying they don't have a mandate to do that. Well, I mean, some people are, but you know, to Mike's checklist of Caretaker Convention, if there's an urgency, then there's quite a bit the government can do, and I think we're seeing that right now.
Well, first of all, we're not at the moment in caretaker mode.
Well, you raised the possibility, or one of you did, that we might be considered to be in the caretaker.
Oh, well, if we're actually in caretaker mode, that would only occur if the election's called.
Okay.
We're not in caretaker mode. Now, there is an argument that when a prime minister announces his resignation, he's kind of become a dead duck, I guess is the expression. He certainly has the conventional...
Just a lame duck.
Yes,
just a lame duck.
He has a lame duck, sorry. He has the conventional power. There is some argument now on a different issue in which the prime minister is planning to fill the 10 vacancies in the Senate. And there has been some argument that politically he doesn't have the legitimacy to do that, but I think he can do it because we're not in caretaker mode.
Wasn't there a rule that the leadership leader is not able to run for general election? Some people speculate that the reason why some political candidates, such as Champagne or LeBlanc, dropped out of the leadership race because they might run for general elections. And I think this is confusing because of the situation in the Conservative government, which had a rule that said, if you're the interim leader of the party, you cannot run for the leadership of the party. It had nothing to do with general elections. So you couldn't run. I don't know if Mike or Lucas want to correct me on that, but I think there's a little confusion as to the leadership there.
Yeah, I think that's correct. The Conservative Party, if you're the interim parliamentary leader, then you're not eligible to seek the permanent party leadership. Correct. That's right.
Yeah, and it's the same in the Liberal Party. And typically you have that scenario where you go into a general election, the party doesn't win, so whoever is the leader steps down after that general election, or maybe they didn't even win their seat. So then the party chooses an interim leader, someone to represent the party in the House of Commons while the party goes through a leadership race. And typically there's that rule that if you put your name forward to be the interim leader, you can't then run for the permanent leadership because it would be seen as having unfair advantages or using the apparatus of the party to support your own leadership bid. But we don't have that in this situation because the Prime Minister is still serving as the leader of the party until the party selects a new one. So we don't have that interim period in between.
For the answer to this last question, but I want to get your perspective on it. Do you foresee the House to reconvene earlier before March 24, considering the extra funds associated with border security promises to the US President Donald Trump, which I assume will still require Parliament's approval and possibly 30 days from now before the tariff suspension expires? Is that a possibility?
Well, as Mike said, it's a technical possibility. I think politically, the calculus is very difficult. Well, so there's two scenarios, I guess, that we're really talking about. One is the current Prime Minister decides to recall Parliament early because he decides he needs some sort of spending powers or some mandate that he feels he doesn't have now. Although I think the way he's acted shows that he feels he has all the mandate he needs to do anything that the Prime Minister normally could do. And the other scenario is the Liberal Party chooses a new leader and that leader decides to bring Parliament back. I think that's very unlikely because there's going to be so much else they need to do. They're going to need to build their team around them, decide who's going to be in cabinet for all of potentially 2 weeks, all these other things. And having Parliament back is going to be challenging and a fairly hostile environment. So I think a new leader is going to want to give themselves as much time as possible before the House comes back, even though the clock will be ticking on government spending.
Well, first of all, the Prime Minister has only promised these expenditures. They haven't actually occurred.
Yeah.
If they are new expenditures that have not been voted on, I don't think the executive, in fact, in a prorogation, the executive is not allowed to call on what's called Governor General warrants. They're prohibited. So, but that doesn't stop a government. I think the Prime Minister talked about 200 million. It's within the executive authority without parliamentary approval to shift monies around. And, if the government has to start spending some of these border monies, they can probably find them in shifting around current budgets. But if it's regarded as a new budgetary matter and fresh expenditure, well, no, that money can't be spent because Parliament hasn't appropriated it yet.
In the case that Prime Minister Trudeau would ask the Governor General to reconvene Parliament, and Parliament was reconvened, the questioner is asking if this was to happen, which we all agreed is probably very unlikely. If it was to happen, do you think the major political parties are likely to put aside their partisan interests and vote to approve the budget on these items to avoid Trump's tariffs?
I think that's a completely
speculation.
Possible scenario, actually. As we game this out, I mean, we don't know how much more disruption and uncertainty we might have between now and March 4th, which is when the tariffs have been pushed back to. So, yeah, there could be a scenario where the Prime Minister decides, okay, I will reconvene the House of Commons to pass a specific expenditure to respond to the tariffs and maybe supply and something of that nature. And I know Mr. Singh has already expressed some interest in passing changes to the Elections Canada Act ahead of the next election. So there could be a scenario where absolutely the parties, or at least, the Liberals and one other party decide to put their differences aside and reconvene the House and pass some sort of legislation and pass some budgetary measures. The challenge will be is once the government opens up that, once you let that genie out of the bottle, you can't easily put it back in. I think the Prime Minister would have a hard time reconvening Parliament for a week or two to pass that and then say, okay, and now we're going to go back to prorogation. I think it's going to be really hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube. Mike?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is it all depends on Mr. Singh. If Mr. Singh is prepared to cooperate, this is legally possible. It'll probably involve votes to waive the standing orders of the House, grant interim supply. But if he's prepared to do that, this is achievable. The more important question, though, is what are the other two opposition parties going to do? If this is characterized as emergency, I can see the Conservative Party serious. I can't speak for them, but I can see Mr. Poilievre in a position where maybe he'd have to support those measures. I think the Bloc will vote against them. Blanchet has basically said he doesn't care because he's a separatist, and he just wants a general election because they're doing well in Quebec. So I suspect the Bloc would vote against, but I'm not so sure because they're against federal measures anyway, in principle. But I think the Conservatives, I have to be frank about it, could be in a little bit of an awkward political situation if it can be dressed up as an emergency and you sort of go rally around the Canadian flag kind of rhetoric. It might be tough for the Conservatives if it's reconvened to actually vote against those measures. So I think it could happen. It is possible. The key is Mr. Singh. Without Mr. Singh's support in advance, Mr. Trudeau or the new Prime Minister Carney are really not in a position to get anything done.
I think you're right from the Conservative perspective, Mike. And I mean, I could see a scenario where the Conservatives say, yes, we will bring Parliament back and support these measures because we need to respond to the threat of tariffs. And to furthermore respond to this threat of tariffs, we need an election right now. So we have a government with a clear mandate.
Yeah, and what Mr. Poilievre could say, maybe cleverly, he'd say, we'll vote for these measures, but we want a public pledge from whoever the Prime Minister is, if it's Carney or Trudeau, probably Carney, that as soon as these measures are passed and interim supply is voted, he immediately attends on the Governor General and seeks a dissolution. That would be what the Conservatives may try to. They can't force his hand on that, but he might be forced to go along with that in order for these measures to get through.
So I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to especially thank our panelists for being here. Will you give them a hand and thank them for their expertise in sharing it with us? And thank you to all the diplomats and ambassadors from many, I think there's 40 countries represented today. We're so pleased that you've joined us today. And if you will just give me 30 seconds, I'd like to close with a word of prayer and then turn it back over to Darlene for concluding comments. Father in heaven, we thank you today for the great gift of physical life that you have given to us, the ability to be up and around and doing business for you and for our countries. We thank you for the freedoms that we experience in our different countries here today. And I thank you for each ambassador and diplomat and for their countries that they represent. And I pray your blessing on these countries. We recognize today from the chaotic questions and responses that we need divine wisdom. We need divine wisdom to all of us that are involved in leadership. And I pray for that for each of our countries represented. And I pray for that for those who are involved in the leadership selection process for the Liberal Party and also in the subsequent election measures that happen. So thank you for your presence with us today. And we pray your blessing on each one now as we go. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Just so you know, I don't always have the last word when it's Harold and I. But I do want to express my thanks, Harold, and to each of you, Lucas and Mike, for being with us today, as well as each and every one of you. And my team and all of the volunteers who've been with us today. Thank you for being here. Que Dieu vous bénisse. May God be gracious to you and bless you and keep you. And we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.